Good morning to all my friends and family, and welcome to this episode of Jim's 5am Club. It's Friday morning. It's another glorious Sydney winter's morning. There's hardly any breeze. It's relatively mild, and it's almost the beginning of the weekend. So one more work day for those who are office bound, a half day for those for tomorrow who are in the construction industry, and the weekend is upon us. What a magnificent location this is. I'm down here at the bottom today of the International Passenger Terminal, where I can see the Harbour Bridge in all its magnificence, and sweep around and see the Opera House that, believe it or not, was once a despised structure back in the 60s, in the mid-60s, when it was being built. People were aghast at how ugly it was, and here we are now in 2022, and we can see it as being one of the most beautiful, most spectacular pieces of architecture, a grand monument that people will come from all over the world to come and see. Anyway, what we'll do today is we'll do what we normally do and go through and mull over a book summary. The book summary that I've got today is entitled The Happiness Hypothesis by an author known as Jonathan Haidt. And we'll look a little bit more deeply into how the brain works. Jonathan talks about the elephant and the rider to help us understand the two different, diametrically opposed parts to our brain that influence our happiness, influence the way we behave, influence the way we see the world. So without further ado, let's kick off and talk a little bit more about this book. And the author here kicks off with an observation, an interesting observation, where he says that love and work are to people what water and sunshine are to plants. So people are nourished by love and work. So we need these two things, according to the author, in our lives in order to live a fulfilled life. They are nourishing, they are necessary, and they create an environment that makes our world a lot more purposeful and a lot more interesting. Anyway, we'll go on now and just examine the brain and talk a little bit more about the brain and how it operates and how it is put together. And the author here reminds us that there are two different parts of our brains. There are two separate parts to our brains. And our brain is made up of the limbic system. The limbic system, which is in charge of the basic functions and instincts such as sleep, food, sex, and that sort of stuff. It's called the reptilian part of the brain. It's the original part of the brain, and it was the brain, or the part of the brain, that was responsible in our early development as a species for staying safe, keeping out of danger, keeping us alert, and ensuring the continuation of the human species. The other part of the brain and it's called the neocortex. Neocortex is the newer part of the brain, according to science, and it looks after the things such as thinking and keeps the limbic brain in check wherever possible. So it's our rational brain. It's the brain that we use to be able to balance our lives and to see things in perspective. So according to science, the neocortex came after the limbic system, and it was the part of the brain that helped us evolve and develop as a human species, to be able to work together, to be able to think, to be able to figure out, to be able to solve the many, many problems, and hence set us apart from the animal kingdom. So the author then goes on to describe the limbic system, or the primitive brain, the reptilian part of our brain, as a wild elephant. And it's the part of the brain that is influenced tremendously by emotion. It's the emotional part of our brain. It's the part of our brain that is irrational. And it's the part of the brain which is instinctive. Just like the animals have an instinctive brain where it's stimulus reaction, similarly the human brain has an aspect or an element to it that enables it to instinctively just do things to ensure our survival. And the instinctive things are, to find food, to be able to sleep, and to be able to copulate and replicate and propagate as a species. So all of these things, to a certain extent, are handled by a part of the brain which is called the limbic system. And it's known, according to this author, or described as a wild elephant. And you can picture a wild elephant in your mind's eye, being big, being motional, and potentially being emotional. You don't want to get in front, or you don't want to be a part of an environment where there's a wild elephant on the rampage. And an apt description, I would say. And the author also goes on to say, or to describe, that the neocortex, the rational part of our brain, the newer part of our brain, is like the rider. And the rider has a responsibility to manage the elephant. And that can be done effectively, but it also can be rather ineffective at times when the elephant is on the move and disturbed and not in a productive mood, so to speak. So the author then goes on to postulate that unhappiness comes when the rider and the elephant are in disagreement. So what we're saying here is when our emotions and our rational part of our being are not in agreement, that's when we tend to be at our most unhappy. So what can we learn from this? Where can this lead us? So it's important, I guess, to put into perspective that between 50 and 80% of our baseline happiness, because the author also suggests that each of us have a thermostat of happiness in our life, and it's called the baseline happiness factor that each of us can express and enjoy. And he says that between 50 and 80% of this baseline is determined by our genes. It's predetermined So when you're born, for example, when you're born, now you have a propensity to be either really, really happy, moderately happy, or relatively unhappy based on your genes. So hence why culturally or within a family context, genetically, some families or some peoples are really, really happy and joyous, and yet other people tend to be miserable. A lot of this, according to the author, is related to our genetic makeup. And we've inherited this from our parents, from our grandparents, from previous generations, and we can also inherit it from our environment in terms of behaviours and habits. We can inherit it from our friends and family, from our teachers, from our schools, from our institutions, from the media. A lot of things go into it. So, as we said, our bodies, our brains, we are wired in a way which can significantly influence our happiness and our baseline happiness, our thermostat. But we can work around it to a certain extent because we can change. As humans, we are fortunate. We can change our thoughts and still learn to train the elephant. So as we said, we're not our genes. We're not our history. We're not our inheritance. We have a propensity to be like that by what we've inherited from our parents in terms of our genetic makeup. But we can work it. We can train the elephant. We can take control as the rider through our thoughts and influence our future in a positive way if we choose to. So it is possible, according to the author, to influence your future and your happiness and your baseline happiness by the things that you think about and the thoughts that you load into your brain. So we'll go on to discuss now that your limbic brain is trained to look for danger everywhere, and by choosing to be an optimist, you can lessen its hold on you. As we said before, there was once a time in prehistoric times when life was a lot more dangerous than what it is today. There was danger lurking at every corner, behind every tree. There could have been a saber-toothed tiger that was about to leap out and eat you or eat your family. There could have been villagers from a next village wanting to come and attack you and take your wife and take your children. And hence, there was a necessity in terms of our survival to want to be attuned to our environment and to always be looking out for danger and to have that front of mind. But what we're saying now in 2022, our world is relatively less dangerous than what it used to be. And we don't need to be looking out for danger at every corner because of the legal systems that we have, the social systems that we have, and the abundant wealth that we all enjoy, that we don't need to be dog eat dog in order to survive. And life is a lot safer these days, and hence we don't need to depend on that thermostat or that part of the brain to instinctively get us to react and jump at every shadow. But now we're in a position where we can have a space between stimulus and response. And that space, according to Stephen Covey, is our ability to think and to consider the first, second, and third level consequences of our actions, and hence choose the appropriate action to take that will influence our future, or our futures, or our imagined futures, based on the consequences that we're able to perceive in our mind's eye. So, as the author here says, these days you don't have to be on guard all the time for danger, but you can be an optimist, and you can lessen the hold that fear, uncertainty, and doubt have on our lives. The author talks about the power of reciprocity, and reciprocity is the ability to make sure that fairness is delivered. In the author's words, reciprocity, we prefer to get nothing rather than an unfair share, believe it or not. So people prefer to get nothing rather than an unfair share. So what we should be trying to do is to leverage reciprocity and to admit that we've made a mistake next time, for example. And by admitting to our errors and our mistakes, you're basically inviting our opponents, instead of trying to fight us, to work with us and to try and reciprocate and quell the situation, as opposed to continuing to fuel it and to flame it and to air it with further problems. So the author talks about the fact that we are surrounded by biases, and I guess we know that there are confirmation biases. There are so many biases that influence the way we see the world, the way we interpret the things that happen in the world and around us. And one of those biases that the author talks about is the self-serving bias. And as an example, the elephant thinks that you are always right, and the author or the writer usually defends it. So, you know, we've worked with people, we've lived with people who are convinced that what they're doing is right, and even if it is entirely wrong or obviously wrong, it's amazing how the elephant and the writer convince each other through this self-serving bias and continue to do things which are wrong, thinking or perceiving that they are actually right, because they are influenced, as we said, and as the author says here, by a particular bias. The author also goes on to talk about a thing called an adaptation principle bias, and which suggests that we get used to things, we get used to our environment, we get used to the people that we hang out with, and we get used to good or bad events. Sooner or later, you get used to it. You get used to the people around you, and then you start to accept them, and then that becomes a problem in itself. So just like, you know, when people win a lottery or are paralyzed, sooner or later they will return to their baseline happiness level, rather than reacting to it. So what we're saying is that even if a person wins the lottery and is an instant millionaire, multi-millionaire, regardless of how much money that they've won, imagine, irrespective of how much fame they achieve, they will automatically and systematically return to their baseline happiness level. As we said before, that level is genetic, and it comes when we're born. We have a thermostat which is already set in terms of what our happiness level or what our propensity to be happy is. And regardless of how much money you gain, if you have a low propensity or a low happiness threshold or a low happiness level, a low happiness baseline, then you're going to be miserable again. And on the contrary, if you're a happy sort of person who has a high happiness baseline, and you're made a paraplegic, for example, or you're injured or something happens to you, then sooner or later you're going to see the world as a beautiful place again, because you're going to return slowly but absolutely surely to your baseline happiness level, which, if it was high, genetically high, or genetically you're inclined to be happy, then you're going to achieve that once more. So I guess that's probably where we are at. That's about it. I remember as a young man, at a young age, deciding that I want to be happy. I want to see the world as a better place rather than to be negative and to be miserable. I'm not saying that I'm not negative and I'm not miserable on occasion, but generally I try and be as happy as I can. I try to be optimistic. I have an uncle of mine, Uncle Arthur, who said, "James, you are so optimistic that if Santa Claus brought you a box, a big box for Christmas, and he said that there was a pony in there, and you looked in the box and all you could see is manure, you'd be digging through the manure saying that there's got to be a pony here somewhere." So it's important, I guess, to accept and to appreciate that we inherit in our families, in our cultures, a certain degree of happiness in terms of a happiness quotient, or that thermostat that we talked about, the baseline happiness level. But you're not limited to that level of happiness, is the key message from this book. And you can, through your thinking, through the rider, tame the elephant, guide the elephant, and appreciate and welcome a certain level of happiness and brightness into your world. It's getting lighter here in Sydney, and as you can see, the monuments are starting to stand out. It's going to be a brilliant day. It's going to be a spectacular sunrise, but I need to head off to the train station and head off to work. But in the next half an hour, the sun will come up just behind the Opera House there, and it will be, I guarantee, a spectacular sunrise, a spectacular Sydney winter's sunrise. Anyway, take care, and I look forward to chatting to you again. I appreciate you joining me on this episode of Jim's 5am Club. I'm well on my way to achieving the 1,500th vlog over the next month or two. Couldn't believe it possible, but once I get started on something, I just get on a path and I just click away one at a time, and it's amazing how much productivity one can generate once they build a head of steam. So take care, have a wonderful Friday and an awesome weekend, and wishing everybody all the very best on this wonderful day. Yassas, take care, and bye for now.